Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. When you turn on the TV, you're almost certain to see these DNA tests to find out where exactly you're from. Today's guest actually found his mother because of these DNA tests. Today's guest is Terry Difazio, who is a employee of Northeast Kingdom TV.
That's me.
What's your role?
I am the program manager and also what do they call it? Video program production manager too.
Right. You had a very fascinating story recently. With the help of DNA, you were actually able to track down your biological mother.
Yeah, it wasn't just the DNA, but that did help quite a bit. Originally, before Ancestry DNA got started, I tried an agency in New Jersey who took my $400 and the woman split. They eventually caught this woman and threw her in prison, but I didn't get my money back. I think it was Ancestry ran a sale. Normally it's $175 for this test. And what they do is they send you a tube and you fill out a form and you spit in the tube and you send it out to Salt Lake City, Utah. And they match you up with DNA and they tell you what your ancestry would have been. And mine was mostly Southern European and some Western European. So I believe my ancestry showed that I was related to people from anywhere from England all the way south to Italy and even as far west as Greece or Turkey. So that was pretty interesting how that came out.
Right. And so, all right, first, so were you placed for adoption when you were a baby?
Yes.
And did you always know that?
I found out probably, I think I was about 8 or 9 years old, but I don't know exactly the circumstances. But when I was 8 or 9 years old, my parents told me I was adopted.
And how did that impact you?
Actually, I felt kind of special because I was hand chosen.
Right.
Whereas everybody else, you have a child and it's yours,
right.
And you have that bond. I felt it was pretty neat that somebody came somewhere and said, "Oh, I want that one."
So it sounds like you had a good life.
Yeah, my adopted parents were good people. They were hardworking, blue collar people, and they did the best they could. They didn't have the most education, but they weren't dumb by any means either. My father never got to go to high school. He was unfortunate in that he got into 9th grade, and that was it. Back then, you could drop out in 9th grade,
right? But
now, of course, you can't, which I think is a good thing. My mom went right through high school. My dad died in 1998, and my mom died in 2010.
Right. Had you? So, at what age did you start wondering about who you are biologically?
Probably, I'd have to say, several times in the early 1990s, because as well as I do, you go to the doctor's office, and what's one of the things they ask you? Do you have a family history of cancer, heart disease, hoof and mouth, beriberi? They ask you all these questions about, medical things, and I had to keep saying, I don't know. I never met them. So I was always quite curious about it. And in 1992, lo and behold, my adopted mom, her name was Elizabeth Rupert, she handed me my adoption papers, and she said, "You have a right to know." And those papers had never been opened since 1952, I believe it was, which is when they got the papers. Because I was born in 51, and it took a while for them to actually place me. And I guess my biological mom had to sign off. I guess it was after 6 months or something. So I opened the papers up, and I looked in there, and I found all this, information, which was pretty interesting. My birth name was Terrence Edward Difazio. I was adopted and became Terrence Lewis Rupert. I assumed, since my parents were not married, that Difazio was my mom's name, but I was wrong. That was the old man's name. So we went that route for a while, and I did find some of the old Difazio family,
right.
And they didn't want to have anything to do with me.
Did they know about you? Do you know?
From what I can recollect, I spoke with my half-sister, Bernadette. She and her sister, Diane, did not know. But when they talked to my two aunts, which were my father's older sisters, that's when it all went south. They said, you don't want anything to do with him. And in my opinion, it was because they were old New York City Roman Catholics, and you didn't do such things. You didn't have illegitimate children. That was all swept under the rug.
Right.
You know how that works, right?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So that's how that ended up. And so I decided, well, I'll take a step back and I'll go another route. And I happened to stumble upon, I wish I could remember exactly how I did it, but I stumbled upon a woman in Western Pennsylvania. And her title is Adoption Rights Advocate, Genealogist, and Search Angel. Mm-hmm. Her name is Priscilla Sharp. And what she does is she helps people reunite with their biological parents. Mm-hmm. She's been fighting for legislation to change this closed adoption laws that are in New York. New York happens to be one of the worst for closed adoptions. When you have a closed adoption, and I called Angel Guardian Home in Brooklyn, New York, which is now Mercy First Hospital, they'll give you non-identifying information, but they're legally not able to give you anything more. Mm-hmm. So for years, I just, I got non-identifying information. I found out about my mom, found out about her mom, a little bit about my dad, but I didn't get any names. Mm-hmm. So Priscilla and I worked together for a while. And when I spoke to this nun in Mercy First Hospital, I kept prodding her for information. And I said, okay. She said, I can't tell you anything more. But if you guess something and you're right, I'll let you know. And if you guessed wrong, I'll let you know. So the first thing I said was, I'm going to assume Difazio was my mom's name. She said, nope, guess again. So that's a big clue right there. So I said, well, my name was Terrence Edward Difazio. Was my old man's name Edward Difazio? She said, no, but you're close. It turned out his name was Robert Edward Difazio. Mm-hmm. So that's how I sort of made contact with him. And actually, I got in touch with Bernadette and that crew through my wife's Facebook. I don't have Facebook, but she does. So as time went on, we kept searching, and I kept hitting Ancestry DNA hits for second and third cousins. Right. And then lo and behold, along came a first cousin. And it turned out it wasn't a first cousin, it was a half aunt who lives in Long Island. Her name is her married name was Lily Didus, mm-hmm. and her maiden name was Bernhardt. So her name was Lillian Bernhardt, and it turns out that's what my mom's name is. Her name was Marguerite Bernhardt, mm-hmm. and that was the connection that Priscilla was able to make for me.
So what was the reaction when you contacted your aunt?
Yeah.
What was her reaction?
Oh, we were happy as all heck.
Did she know about you?
She sort of did, but she really didn't know because she's a half aunt. In other words, we share the same father, but not the same mother.
Right.
So she's actually my mother's half sister.
Right.
My background is 75% Italian, 25% German. Hers is German and Polish. Mm-hmm. So we shared the same, I guess, grandmother, you'd say.
Right.
But not the same grandfather. And anyways, Lily's a hoot. I talked to her, and I've got to tell everybody out there, every time I speak to her on the telephone, she sounds like Cyndi Lauper.
You want to give a Cyndi Lauper impression?
She goes, hi, Terry, how are you doing today? So Lily and I get along good. We talk on the phone all the time. We email all the time.
So is she the one who connected you to your mother?
Actually, no, Priscilla did the last piece, but Lily was the last bridge to cross.
Right.
Lily's maiden name being Bernhardt, Priscilla was able to couple that with this other genealogy that she'd done. Right. Priscilla is extremely good. If anybody out there wants to find out, if you're an adoptee and you don't know who your biological parents were, I recommend you get in touch with this woman.
And they can contact you here at NEK-TV, and you can help facilitate that.
Absolutely. And there was one guy that heard me talking about this at Kinney Drugs one day, and I told him all about it. I don't know if he's done anything about it, but I gave him the information. And I would be more than happy to help anybody who wants to know, this is how you've got to do it. This is the information age. It's not like it was before. Right. Now you can actually help yourself. Right. If you don't mind doing the footwork,
right.
It's there for you.
So how did your mother find out finally that you were still alive and out there?
Well, Priscilla gave me her phone number
Yeah.
and said, call her. I said, oh, you don't want me to write her? And she said, no, call her. So I called, and the phone had been disconnected. She had, I found out later that the phone number that I originally received was from a nursing home in DeLand, Florida.
Hmm.
She had been moved to Winter Garden, Florida. So Priscilla said, don't give up. You've got a brother who is the chief of police for Orange County, Florida.
Mm-hmm.
And his name is Peter Thomas.
Right.
So I called him, and he wouldn't return my calls for a while. And eventually I got in touch with him. And when I got in touch with him, he said, I don't know anything about you. And I had to reassure him that this was not a scam.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out he was adopted also.
Right.
So he was adopted, I was adopted. He didn't know anything about me. And when he said, I'm going to tell my mom, and I'm going to tell my sister Jill, I said, oh, got a sister. Okay. They're into genealogy.
Right.
It seems that my mother told my sister but never told the two boys. My mom had me and had to give me up. 4 years later, she married a man by the name of John Thomas. They tried for 14 years to have children, and they couldn't have children. So they adopted two boys, John and Peter.
Right.
And then 2 years later, they actually had Jill. So 1 month after I graduated from high school, I have a half sister.
Oh, really? Oh. So what did? How did your? So when you? So you contacted your brother,
Mm-hmm.
and then what was your mother's response? Do you know when?
Well, Jill called me the next day.
Yeah.
Jill, I have to tell you right now, I love my little sister. She's one of the most wonderful people I've ever known. And she told Mom, and then she wrote back and said, this is what she said before that. When we were talking on the phone, before she told her mom that I had found her, she said that my mom has been celebrating my birthday for every year, and I was 66 at the time. So I knew this was going to be a good thing. My mom's reaction was great. When I finally got down to Florida to meet her, it was an immediate bond between me and my sister, immediate bond between me and my mom.
Right.
One of my two brothers, Peter, and I get along fine. He's a great guy. The other brother doesn't like me. He refuses to meet me. He doesn't want to have anything to do with me. He's very, very jealous. So that's the story of that.
So what was the reunion like when you walked in and saw your mother for the first time?
Well, like I said, it was an immediate bond. I bent down and my mom is confined to a wheelchair.
Right.
And she can transfer in and out of bed and in and out of a car, but that's it. I guess she's taken some pretty hard falls. She's 85 years old. And like I said, I hugged her and I kissed her, and we talked and talked and talked.
Do you hold anything against her because she gave you up?
Absolutely not. I don't hold any grudges against her or my biological father. I hold no grudges against any of them. That was a different era. And what people have to realize is that in 1951, if a man didn't want to take responsibility, he could get out of it by going into the service,
Right.
which is what Robert did. He went into the Navy.
Right.
So, and my mom didn't have the money to raise me or take care of me. There were no social services available back then. It just the way it was. So I don't hold any grudges towards any of them, and that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, Scott.
Have you reached back out to your father's family now that this has all come around, or have you?
I did write to Bernadette once, but she basically told me in her last email, I don't want any more communication. And whenever I've written to her, I get absolutely zero response.
You know, I have been a skeptic of this whole DNA.
Mm-hmm.
I don't deny it. Then but being a history person, I just couldn't resist it. I did 23andMe. It's a DNA program. And,
oh, yeah, I've seen that, yeah.
And, well, I know pretty much just from being interested in history and genealogy, I kind of know who I am, as in my makeup. So when it came back, it was like it nailed just about everything. There was a couple things I didn't know, or I just didn't ever think about. First of all, I'm mostly French, English, Irish. Then there's a smattering of German in there, and but what I and I also knew I had a bit of Native American, and that was all confirmed. But then there was a couple little surprises. A little bit of Jewish showed up, and a little bit of African American, and those are the only real. But what really was interesting is when I put my when I did mine, my father had done his, and the mechanism instantly connected us as being father and son or direct relatives with all that whole database out there. It picked out my father as being, I can't remember if it picked him out as my father or as a direct relative. And it actually kind of convinced me that there is some validity behind these.
Oh, definitely is. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tell you my own story, because the reason I was fascinated with yours is mine's a bit different. My grandmother was born in Newfoundland, and I didn't know where she was from, but she ended up going, like a lot of maritime women, would go to Massachusetts, work for part of the year, send money home to the people back home, to her family back home. Well, while she was there, come to find out, she ran into my grandfather, who was working in Massachusetts. He was from Irishburg, but working in Massachusetts at the time. They met, married, and when my mother was 3 or 4, my grandmother died. And my mother had no recollection of her mother. She ended up dying during the tuberculosis epidemic. And come to find out, my grandfather never even knew where his wife was really from. He just knew she was from one of the provinces, because they hadn't been married too long. They lost all contact with my mother's maternal family. So must be my mother was probably something like 70 at the time, and she knew nothing about that wing of the family. And it took me at least a year to track down her family, because I didn't know if her family, I found documents that said New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland. And to make a long story short, after a lot of footwork, I was able to connect her with her first cousins. So she went up, and she ended up having a family reunion with her first cousins. Most of them didn't even know she existed, and some of them didn't even know they had this aunt who'd gone away. But now, fast forward to 20 years later, I could have done that exact same search because of the internet. That search that took me a year, I could probably do in a day now because of the internet. So I would be interested if we'd had DNA. Well, we did have DNA tests back then, but it was more primitive. Whether that would have helped me as well.
Not sure, but you're actually pretty lucky. It only took you a year. It took me 14.
Oh, that's true. Yeah,
But you actually knew who your biological parents were.
Yeah, I knew the last. I knew my grandmother's last name. I even knew her maiden name. The real question for me was to find which province they were from. And finally, I got a call from, it was actually Ontario. It was with it ended up being my mother's first cousin who'd read an article that I put in one of the she was from Newfoundland, but she'd lived in Ontario, and she said, "Hey, I'm your cousin." So that's how come I'm fascinated with your story. But your story isn't the only one linked to DNA tests around here. There's another woman who I won't say her name right now because I haven't asked her, but she was adopted. It was a very obvious adoption. She knew it all of her life, but she must be about 50 now, and her parents are very open with her finding out more about herself. And the last I understood is she took a test, and she's now linked to some of her biological family.
You know, when I met my mom, you brought up a question before, and I didn't fully get to to the whole story.
Right.
If you're adopted, there is a way around it in a way. If you're adopted, and I did this, you can. I knew I was adopted in Brooklyn, New York.
Right.
Actually, my mom and dad were from Queens.
Right.
You can go to the state adoption registry and say that you're looking.
Right.
And if your biological parents are in that registry and looking, they will connect you.
Right. Right.
But they have to. And my mom did not realize that she could do that.
And that generation probably didn't. Yeah, I think a lot of that generation probably don't have a clue that they can do some of these things.
I know my poor mom has an email, but she never checks it. She doesn't really understand it that much. And I know my adopted parents, they didn't know the first things about computers or internet or anything like that. But if you're adopted and you're having the same trouble that I had, you can register. Say if you were born in Vermont, you could go to the adoption registry and you can say, I'm looking.
Right.
Because the non-identifying information that I received from Angel Guardian Home said that my mom and dad were from Queens.
Right.
So I knew I was adopted in Brooklyn. So you can register and you can find out these things.
You know, there's a question about nature versus nurture. You know, who you are, how much of it is your upbringing versus your genetics and everything. When you look at some of your biological family, like your mother and your half biological sister, is there anything that says, wow, I am them? Or do you think you're more your adoptive family?
Probably, and that's a good question. Nature versus nurture has always been a very good question, and I think both play a big part in it. You can't get away from the fact that you're born a certain way, you grow to a certain height.
Yeah.
You have a genetic background. For example, you look, some guys are made to play basketball, and some guys aren't. And I can definitely see similarities between me and my mother and my sister. Very, very stark similarities. And there's no question that there are a lot of things we share. For example, my sister and I both have a history of kidney stones.
Right.
Don't ask me why. And my other half sister, Bernadette, that I was able to speak with for about a month. She and I both had a history of nosebleeds until we were about 20. And there are other little things like that. But you can definitely see where nature comes in, and you can definitely see where nurture comes in. And that's a good question.
Right. Do you have, is there any mannerisms you guys have? Like, I've been told I talk with my hands. No. Yeah, that might be a surprise to anybody who watches my show that I do talk with my hands. Do you have any? Did you look at your mother and say, geez, we have this?
Not really, because like I said, my mom is much older and her mobility is very limited. But she has a propensity to gain weight really quickly.
Yeah.
And so do I.
Yeah.
If I'm not careful, I can get very, very heavy very quickly. And my mom had to lose a lot of weight. She got really, really big. I don't know about my sister, like I said, because our fathers were different.
Right.
But mannerisms, I don't think so, other than the fact that I worked to lose my New York accent.
Right. You didn't lose it very well.
Yeah, I did.
No, I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, you're a New Yorker.
Well, I don't talk like this no more.
Oh.
That's New York. Like my father and all of my cousins who lived in Brooklyn from my adopted family, they all had that heavy accent, like Bernie Sanders.
Right.
I worked to get rid of that. And you can definitely hear that accent still with my mom. You can hear that.
Right.
My little sister, she doesn't have it.
Right.
Because she was raised in Florida.
Right. So it sounds to me, I hate to say it, is you may have caught your mother on her, last.
Yeah.
It sounds like she's in somewhat failing health.
Mm-hmm.
How would you have felt if you were just a year too late?
I would have felt pretty bad, but there was nothing I could do about it.
Right.
I remember speaking the last time I spoke to my mom. She said, she jokingly, she says to me, "Where did you go? I couldn't find you." I said, "Well, nobody told me who you were." I said, when I changed my name legally to Difazio, I said, I thought that was your name. I said, if I'd have known your name was Bernhardt, I would have changed it to that.
Right. No change, no idea, no desire to change your name from Rupert to Difazio to Bernhardt now?
No, I did think about it, but I said, nah, that one name change is enough. It caused enough paperwork. You wouldn't believe the paperwork you've got to go through to have to do a name change.
Oh. So are you, do you have any more plans of going down to visit anytime soon?
Oh, yes. We go down and then visit. We go to Florida for a month
Right.
every year. We had planned to go to Florida to Panama City Beach.
Yeah.
And we ended up, we were going to go to New Smyrna Beach, sorry. When we found out my mom was alive, instead of waiting until March, we went in December.
That's good.
We went 5 weeks after we found out. I said to my wife, Barbara, who was extremely understanding about this and very, very supportive, I said, let's not wait. My mom she's in okay health. She doesn't have a lot of dementia. She has a little bit, but not much. And I said, what would happen if she had died and we didn't take this opportunity? So we went down in December, and we stayed about 10 days, and then we went back again in March. And we're going to go back again this March also.
Now, not saying that you weren't at peace before you found her, but do you feel, is there a different feeling now that you kind of know who you are?
Well, that's a good question. Somebody asked me if I felt whole or complete, and I said, I don't think you ever feel complete or whole, because once you do that, then you give up and there's nothing left to live for. Right. But I have to admit, I feel better.
Right.
I feel more comfortable, and I feel happier because I found them. Because when you really look at the person that gave you birth, it's a different feeling. Not that my adopted parents weren't good; they were very good people. Right. They could not have children, so they did the next thing that they could do. They adopted.
Are you the only child?
Yes. Okay. And I have one son. And for many years, I used to tell people, see my son Jonathan? He's the only biological relative that I have that I know. Now when I found out all this information and I spoke to him, I said, you've got cousins.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you have nieces and nephews too?
Yes, I have a niece by the name of Carly, and I have two nephews, Merrick and Raymond. And let me think. I also have, my adopted brother Peter has a son also, so I'm not related to his son, but he's basically a nephew.
Does anybody call you uncle?
Merrick does. He's 12. Yeah. When I went down the first time, I didn't get to meet him, and my sister got me laughing. She says, I didn't get to see Merrick because Merrick was with his father. And he said, when am I going to get to meet Uncle Terry? And he kind of got me chuckling, but he's the only one that does.
I think what you've done is great, and I think you did it in such a way where it was, you don't have anything against your adoptive parents. It doesn't sound like you've forgot what they've done. They did for you. Are they still alive?
No. My adopted dad died in 1998, and my adopted mom died in 2010.
Knowing them, how would they feel for you if they could see you today, knowing that you've made contact? What do you think they would think?
Well, I can tell you exactly, Scott. That's a great question. No one's ever asked me in all the interviews I've done, and I've done about 5 of these. No one's ever asked me that question. My adopted dad did not want me to find out anything. He said, "Bury it. You might find out things you don't like." To which I said, "Who cares now?
Yeah.
Who cares now what might have been? I mean, I wanted to find out medical information." He probably would not have been happy. But when I shared with my adopted mom my non-identifying information, she actually broke down and cried for my biological mother. She said, that must have been so hard to have given you up. And she was right. So my adopted mom would have been happier than heck. She would have, I think that she and my mom would have got along really well.
You got to look at it as, no matter the reason you're giving up a child, but to give life and to be able to, to give it to somebody else. I don't know if I could do that, but I have so much admiration for anybody who can do that. And, they gave your parents something that, they couldn't, have themselves.
Yeah, I think adoption is a wonderful thing, and for people that can't have children, I think that that's the way to go. It's it's good to have all the kids you want, but it's better to want all the kids you have.
Right, exactly.
And if you can't have any children, I think adoption's a wonderful thing. I don't think there's any reason why adoption, I mean, I think that adoption is still quite big.
Right, right.
And I recommend it for anybody. I don't see anything horrible about it. I guess at one point in time, I think my adopted dad told me that way back when he was growing up, if you had an adopted child, you didn't tell anybody.
Right.
You just didn't say.
You know, you said something that really, I see it happen quite a bit. You said your mother couldn't have children for 14 years. Then she adopted 2 kids, right?
Yeah.
And then she finally did get pregnant. I hear so many people who were, they couldn't get a diagnosis on why they couldn't get pregnant, but they tried for years and years. But once they adopted, they ended up getting pregnant. And some people feel that there's just once you start relaxing and just,
I've heard that. I don't know how true it is, but anything is possible.
No, but I've heard. Okay, well, you know how the show works. We only have a 30-minute time slot, and that time is up. But I've been wanting to get you on because ever since I had my own test, and I said, hey, there's something to this. And then I've been listening to you tell your story. Then I've been hearing other stories, and I've been saying, hey, we've got to get Terry on the show. He isn't too far away, only an office down.
That's right.
Hey, thank you for coming on. I think it's great what you did, and I think it's great that you're coming on. And if somebody wants to talk to you about how to get started, what's the number here?
The number here is 334-0264. You can call or you can stop in. I'll help you in any way I can.
Okay. All right. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Scott. Have a good day.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.